Yes. Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Monica Hasso. I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you for being here for our February Alive Academy, Transforming Disruption to Impact with Miss Beth Steinhorn presenting. Alive is very happy and pleased to be hosting this session. The session is 60 minutes in length, and you can stay. If you can't stay the whole 60 minutes, please, if you're a member of Alive, you can log on to our Alive website and catch the replay at a later time. But we hope, of course, that you'll stay for the entirety of today's session. Our agenda for today looks like this. So we'll do a brief overview, deal with some housekeeping notifications, introduce our presenter, go through our main presentation today, and then, of course, we'll have time at the end for questions and maybe a little discussion. Stay tuned at the end of the webinar to also learn about our next Academy Alive session and a book giveaway that we are very excited to be able to do today as a special gift. So stay tuned for that. A couple of housekeeping items for all of us. Please make sure you're on mute to minimize background noise. Please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A session throughout the session. The more engaging, the more questions, the better. The session will be recorded, as I mentioned earlier, so we'll place a slide deck, recording, and there will be handouts as well at the end for you to download and access. It'll be also under file archive in a few days on our website. So now we are introducing our presenter. I am pleased, honored, humbled to be able to present Ms. Beth Steinhorn doing our Academy Alive session today. And she is president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. A little bit about Ms. Beth. She's president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. Beth partners with organizations and their leadership to increase their impact through strategic and innovative engagement. As a thought leader, Beth regularly participates in the national dialogue about volunteerism and engagement and is co-editor of the new book, which we're all very excited about, Transforming Disruption to Impact, Rethinking Volunteer Engagement for a Rapidly Changing World. She provides consulting and training to organizations across the US and Canada, including supporting dozens of organizations to become certified service enterprises. Prior to becoming a consultant, Ms. Beth worked as an executive director and marketing director with education and faith-based organizations, and spent years working with museums as an educator, manager, and anthropologist. I'm super excited. I will go ahead and hand it over to Ms. Beth now to do her presentation. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you everybody for joining today. I'm really excited to be here and to see so many familiar names in the chat or in the participant list. So thank you all for joining, and I hope this will be a great interactive conversation. My goal, as you'll hear, part of our goals for putting this book together really is to drive conversation, and I am delighted to be able to do that with so many of you on the call today. Thank you for the thorough introduction, Monica. I would have shortened that had I known, but in any case, I'm thrilled to be here. What she didn't mention is that I am also a member, longtime member of Alive, so really glad to be among peers today, and I'm tuning in from our office in Denver, Colorado, where it is sunny finally and a little chilly, but really happy to be here. So I'd like to start this dialogue about transforming disruption to impact with a story that surfaced as we were collecting all of these stories as part of our work in co-editing this publication together. It was a story that was shared by Cindy Zaghi-Boilo, who is the CEO of the National MS Society. And I'm looking at names. I'm not sure if I've seen any. We may have some MS Society folks on the call today. She contributed a chapter along with Lauren Spiro, Vice President for Volunteer Engagement for the MS Society. And Cindy's story goes like this. a few years back, pre-COVID-19, a teacher friend of hers told her a story about a grade school field day competition among students, and the teams had formed organically. And one team clearly had all of the advantages that come with weight and confidence. And that was especially poignant because, as you may have guessed from the image on the screen, the competition was tug of war. Rather than intervening to even out the teams in a rational, athletic-based way, the friend instead gravitated to the underweight team and called out to them and said, "Okay, team, let's huddle." So the children all gathered and put their heads together literally while the teacher explained the strategy to winning tug of war. She said, "Hold onto the rope with both hands. Start with your left foot in front, and at the sound of the bell, all together lean back and pull. Keep both feet on the ground and grip the rope, use all your weight and lean back together." And after the game was over and the lighter, less confident team won, she overheard two of the kids talking and saying, "You beat us like it was nothing." And the winning team member said simply, "Well, next time you should try a huddle." And I've told the story a couple times, more than a couple times in the last few months since the publication of the book, and people often look puzzled, like, what in the world does this have to do with the disruptions that we've experienced? And to me, it's so poignant because it's really about adapting and pulling together, especially in a time of challenge when over the last couple of years, it was especially hard for us to even huddle, let alone know what game we were even playing, right? We were suddenly thrown into a game, maybe not the best metaphor, where the rules had changed. We didn't know what they were. And the importance of putting our heads together literally and figuring out a strategy that was going to help us is what, in many ways, through our collections of stories, separated those organizations that continued to engage volunteers in a sustained way and continue to deliver their mission related impact from those that didn't. So in this session today, over the next 50 minutes and change, I'm going to share a little bit about the landscape of disruption, how many of the organizations that we have been working with or collecting stories from over the last couple of years rethought their strategy and their engagement practices, and hopefully give you a chance to weigh in on that as well. And then we're also going to talk about rethinking impact. There'll be time for Q&A, and I encourage you to, as Gretchen noted, please use the chat so we can see the questions, and we'll also be pausing throughout for some Q&A. So obviously, thanks to what Monica mentioned, today's session was inspired not just by that story, but by dozens of stories that I had the privilege of collecting over the last 24 months. It was about an 18-month process of first conceiving of the idea for this book and then developing the book that was released on November 1st. And as I understand it, if you stay on the call, you may have a chance to win a copy. So hopefully that'll keep you engaged. The book is Transforming Disruption to Impact, Rethinking Volunteer Engagement for a Rapidly Changing World. And the book features stories from nearly 24 leaders, some very well known to us in this field, and others who should be known for their perseverance and for their innovations. Stories from CEOs of organizations like Cindy from the MS Society, and as well as funders, practitioners, corporate engagement consultants, and others. And our goal really was to offer a collection of proven pathways to impact so that organizations can break the trail of their own journey from disruption to impact. Of course, the last couple of years, starting in 2020 here in the US, we really began to face a whole host of disruptions. And disruptions can be very challenging for organizational leaders, for volunteers, and the communities that are being served. The interruption and limitations were naturally very disheartening, shall we say. They were disturbing, they were disconcerting. And yet, I firmly believe that disruption is not inherently bad. Disruption can be the impetus to release ourselves from the tyranny of the way we've always done things, so to speak. If viewed as an opportunity, disruption can invite us to revisit, to rethink, and reinvent the way that we achieve mission. And it may even prompt us, as we certainly observed, to retire practices that no longer serve us. So really the question is, how can disruptions bring about new perspective? Excuse me. I do want to share that you will be receiving actually 3 handouts. I believe you'll be able to download at the end of this session a PDF of the slides, if you're so interested, a copy of our book group facilitation guide, should you want to continue these conversations with colleagues in your area or across the virtual miles. And you'll also get a handout to just drive conversations back at your organization. So let's dive into this concept of disruption. There were a couple themes that we saw of different types of disruptions affecting the landscape. And those disruptions were really varied, excuse me, and widespread. So here are 5 that we saw in particular. And then I'll kind of take each one by one. Of course, volunteering, starting in 2020, was disrupted in really significant ways due to health concerns and regulations. We saw some organizations discontinuing or reducing services or suspending services to communities, while at the same time, we saw other organizations extending and expanding services due to the crisis. At the same time, we had this increased focus on the reckoning around racial inequities and injustices, and we saw the service sector recognizing more widely how these inequities may play out in terms of access, or not just may, do play out in terms of access and inclusion in volunteerism. There's also a whole narrative going on around ageism. So I want to unpack that one as well. And then finally, there was the continuation of a long-standing trend, which were shifting expectations of volunteers and by necessity of how organizations engage volunteers. So let's dive in and take these one by one before we then move into how some of these organizations, what were the themes that we saw in terms of response to these disruptions. As you likely, I can't imagine it would surprise you, we know that volunteerism was disrupted quickly and in a widespread way in March of 2020. According to research by Volunteer Match, that was launched in late March and April of 2020, 93% of all volunteering had just been reported canceled. What did that mean? It meant that as well, organizations like ALIVE, Volunteer Match, IAVE, the International Association for Volunteer Efforts, all of these organizations really had to shift from merely supporting volunteer engagement professionals to instead making the case for volunteer engagement and how to do that while keeping volunteers safe. In our chapter by the leaders of IAVE, Nicole Cirillo and her colleague, she wrote, in some countries, it was challenging to gain recognition for the important contribution volunteers could make during the crisis. The mobilization of volunteers was necessary to provide help during the pandemic, but the challenge of keeping volunteers safe was also of paramount importance. And again, I can't imagine that's a surprise to any of you. In fact, it may be a little it may be hearkening back a little too close to home of the types of challenges you were facing. But the reason that I share that is that you were not alone if you were working in this field at that time. And we saw organizations, again, like IAVE, your local Dovia, ALIVE, of course, really having to shift their focus, looking to promote new partnerships, tap into and support informal volunteering, and leveraging technology in different ways. We found these disruptive innovations were occurring as a result. We also saw that, of course, as I've indicated, services were either suspended or, in many cases, extended quite dramatically. We saw that organizations like, of course, museums, arts organizations, sports organizations, organizations like Special Olympics, which cross multiple different areas of our field, they were suspending services quite dramatically as especially arts organizations were shuttering their doors. At the same time, we saw organizations like food pantries and by summer 2020, employment service organizations during our employment placement, employment training organizations, while we were in this period of great layoffs and recession, they were extending their services quite dramatically. And so further research by our colleagues over at Volunteer Match at the time did some additional research on what was happening in the field and some of the findings that they surfaced during this, in light of this kind of differential experience, some organizations kind of shutting down and putting volunteers on hiatus versus those that needed to suddenly engage volunteers or different volunteers in new ways. That of course recruitment had to shift dramatically. That while interest was high, as I'm sure will sound very familiar to you, interest does not necessarily equal activation. Research by Points of Light at the time said volunteers were really, really interested in serving, but we also know that interest does not necessarily mean that they were flooding your application pools. And we also saw that equitable access has a long way to go. And yet one of the things that I found most profound in Laura Plato's reflections on all of this learning is that while it's important that we leverage technology, it's important that we try to overcome some of that fear, that we also need to keep in mind that the ripple effects of disrupting volunteering. Disrupting volunteering isn't just about affecting service delivery. It's ultimately disrupting human connection. And as she wrote, it's through mindful human presence that we bear witness to one another in all of our messy, joyous, and inspired humanity. And in the process, grow to understand and connect to one another, ourselves, and the world more deeply. So it's helpful to think about, yes, what did it mean for recruitment, which I'm going to circle back to in a moment, but also what does that really mean for the human experience? We also saw, as I've indicated, an increased recognition of inequities in volunteerism. I'm not going to dive into the piece about diversity in our field as professionals as well, but in terms of which is an important issue that a lot of other people have also been writing about and trying to advance. But we were, in this case, looking at how this affects volunteer engagement, even though they're certainly interrelated. And we were so pleased to have some perspective shared by, at the time, MAVA's team member, Wendy Vang Roberts, talking about some of the learnings that they had gathered through their listening sessions during 2020 and 2021, and the advice that they share around increasing understanding of kind of the state of the state at your own organization, and as a vital first step to increasing diversity and equitable access and inclusion at your organization. Things like collecting demographic data, overcoming stereotypes over who can volunteer. And to me, this relates a lot to some other conversations we have and are so pleased to have collected around the relationship between formal and informal volunteering, which I'll talk more about later, and recognizing that diversity training is not just something for staff or for volunteers, it's for everybody. And I have to say, in the work I've done with, it so happens, a lot of museums in recent years, I'm so pleased to see that DEI training or DEAI training, or some people call it ideas training, or EDI training, whatever order you want to use for this acronym, has become increasingly a required aspect for staff, for paid employees, and for unpaid staff, for volunteers as well. And this disruption of the pandemic provided the, it's all unfortunate and tragic, but there is the opportunity, because volunteering was in so many cases, put on hold for a while. It finally enabled organizations that had been working on DEI for a number of years, but hadn't yet established the requirement or been able to hold volunteers accountable to fulfill a requirement to take diversity training, that in order to return, that became a requirement, and that gave them the opportunity to ensure that everyone was coming in on at least a level playing field in terms of training, and those who opted not to take it have not returned. And these organizations were willing to make that hard decision, not so hard, and say, yep, this is really a part of our return policy and our ongoing commitment to being an anti-racist organization. I've heard that from a number of different organizations. Almost last, I want to talk about ageism, and I will admit this was not one that was top of mind when we first started putting together our list of issues and potential contributors, and it's why I'm so grateful to have had such wonderful co-editors in Doug Bolton, Craig Young, and Jerome Tennille, and that is the issue of ageism. One of the divides that thwarts social cohesion is the divide between generations, and it's driven, certainly, as so many divides are, by instability, by fear, and in this case, in isolation as well. And if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, the public and private discourse really involved a lot of cross-generational blaming. Young people were blamed for spreading the virus, while the higher risk of death and the shutdowns, the higher risk of death for older adults was seen as driving the shutdowns. And so this was a really sticky narrative that pitted generations against each other, and it fueled an increase in ageism. Fortunately, there have been organizations, some predating COVID and some really kind of revising their approaches since COVID, focus on co-generational service as one antidote to this. Co-generational service being defined or distinguished from intergenerational service in that it's not older adults mentoring young adults, or young adults providing services like tech tutoring for older adults. It's all different generations serving together towards a shared cause. And we have seen that this approach to volunteering and civilian national service really can disrupt the age segregation in our civic life. It helps to build bridges across widening divides and increases our ability to solve problems from loneliness to climate change to all sorts of other issues. And finally, we see in this landscape of disruptions this ongoing trajectory of shifting expectations. We've heard many different leading organizations talk about the shift from volunteers expecting a transactional experience to instead expecting a transformational experience. And this in and of itself is disruptive. What we really saw was now as volunteers were reevaluating their own volunteer life, as so many people were reevaluating their professional lives as well, that they were saying, I not only want to drive change through my volunteer hours, I want to be changed as a result of my volunteer hours. And when we're able to tap into that, we really can drive change in some profound ways. So those were 5 of the themes that we captured in our landscape of disruptions, but of course, none of those are really over. And recent research that postdates the publication of the book certainly underscores that. So I'm not going to go into great depth, but I'll share a couple highlights of research, most of which I hope many of you have already heard, right? We saw just in the last few weeks that AmeriCorps released its latest volunteering and civic life in America data that shows not so surprisingly that between 2017, which was the last year for which we had a Volunteering in America report, to 2021, the volunteer rate nationally, the formal volunteer rate nationally dropped from 30.3% to 23.2%. Now that is startling and can perhaps be very disheartening. But again, I don't think it's surprising. And the truth is we bumped up so high between 2015 and 2017. I may be a lone voice in this, but I also feel like 23.2 actually is on par with some years not long before 2017. So it's not as terrible as I personally feared. That said, we know from our own personal experience, I know from conversations with many people across the country and from a couple different research sources that recruitment is a major problem. In fact, the Volunteer Management Progress Report that came out in late January, early February by Toby Johnson and her colleagues shows that among volunteer engagement professionals, recruitment is the #1 problem and has been, it's kind of flopped around, but has been fairly consistently. 32.8% say that recruitment is the biggest challenge. And the second one in line is quite a ways behind that. It's time, capacity, and that's only 13.8%. So recruitment is way out in the front. In fact, that is also reinforced not just by volunteer engagement professionals, but by research that I hope you're also aware of. How old school of me to have it on paper here, but the State of Volunteer Engagement, Insights from Nonprofit Leaders and Funders, which was released by the Do Good Institute through a really great partnership with a whole bunch of different funding partners, the Leedy Foundation, the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, the Lodestar Foundation, the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, UJ Federation of New York, Volunteer Match. I'm probably going to miss some, and my apologies to those. But in any case, what we see through this landmark survey of both executive directors or CEOs of nonprofits and also funders is that many nonprofits, well, in terms of the recruitment piece, nearly 50%, 46.8% of CEOs say that recruiting is a big problem for their organization. So it's not just volunteer engagement leaders who say it's a problem, it's the CEOs who are recognizing that as well. And that number, that percentage has almost doubled from a similar question in a 2003 survey, in which only 29% of nonprofits saw this as a big issue. I guess that's not exactly double, but in any case, it's a significant bump. And as Gretchen is noting in the chat, there's going to be more about this research coming in, was it today's newsletter via live. We also know that the challenges and disruptions aren't over, right? This research from Do Good Institute that came out in that was a survey done in 2022. That many nonprofits, in fact, nearly a third of nonprofit respondents report that they are involving very few volunteers today. And so nonprofits are more likely to experience fewer volunteers or volunteers doing less rather than more to support any specific organizational activity, whether it's fundraising, delivery of services, professional assistance, advocacy. And yet, these decreases are so noteworthy because more than half of nonprofits say that they've had to deliver more services since the pandemic began, which means, we're dealing with this interesting disconnect, an increased demand for services, while there is a decrease in the volunteer workforce that is so vital for that. Not a surprise then that we also see, my last little bit of data, that in the DDI World's Global Leadership Forecast for 2021, the nonprofit burnout rate is unsurprisingly significant. 1 of every 10 employees feels overworked, under-resourced, and disengaged. And I see that as, of course, sad and concerning, but also a great opportunity for us as leaders of volunteers to really make the case for re-engaging volunteers in some profound ways. And that's what I'd like to dive into as we talk about the strategies. But first, I'd love to get your proverbial voices in the room. And so we're going to launch a poll. And I don't know. Yep, it looks like you need to do that, Gretchen.
I'm
So there's a
launching
beautiful. Thank you.
right now.
Thank you.
And on the slide, they're a little bit different on the poll, but
That's okay.
as far as
People are
voting. Yeah, but they are voting.
Smart group, they'll figure it out. Great.
Yes.
So go
Yeah.
ahead and vote. Which of these disruptions affected your organization? You should be able to choose more than one of these. Volunteerism limited, increased recognition of inequities, ageism, expectations of potential volunteers, services extended requiring more volunteers. So yeah, slightly different order. And I'll also, as the numbers are hopefully coming in, I will also say that I want to just re-encourage you to please use the chat if you have any questions, because I will gladly stop along the way, and use the chat as well if there are big disruptions or even little disruptions that you experience that you think are significant trends that I didn't mention that are worthy of recognizing. So feel free to use that. And Gretchen, let me know when I've tap danced long enough and we have a good enough response rate and you can share the results.
Yeah, we've got 81% of the votes are in. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Very interesting.
Okay, there we see. So 65% of volunteerism opportunities limited. That mirrors, I think, some of the data that we were seeing from the Do Good Institute. Nearly a third increasing recognition of inequities in volunteerism. Actually, I've done this poll a number of times, and this is one of the highest instances of ageism being listed. So it'd be interesting, and feel free to weigh in via the chat as to, is that maybe due to the due to the nature of the kind of fields that are represented on this call with so many folks. Changing expectations, that's the highest answer here. And services extended requiring more volunteers. More than 1 in 4 of you, I'm guessing that a lot of you are, food pantries or mental health organizations, employment services, senior services, and maybe some cities as well. I appreciate Megan weighing in. More than a handful of consistent volunteers have moved away as a result of the pandemic. That is a big piece as well, absolutely. And I see one coming in through Q&A. Feel free to use the chat in the future, but let's read what the Q&A one says. Notice that volunteers did not return as we expected, maybe because they found other things to do. Maybe they've moved, like Megan's, or we've been able to recruit new volunteers, but you have been able to recruit new volunteers at a good rate. Wow, Melissa, thank you. I think we're a lot of folks will probably be eager to hear how you did recruit volunteers at a good rate. And we're seeing some other chats. Some volunteers chose not to return. I think that is true of many different organizations. Nicole, a performing arts center, and most of volunteers were older. What we see, and when we get to this in our upcoming themes, it's actually one of the first themes I want to talk about. This whole idea of community became really top of mind, especially when we had older volunteers who had gone on hiatus. Younger volunteers and newer volunteers were recruited to backfill during the height of the pandemic. And then as older volunteers started returning, you have this veterans versus newbie potential conflict. And that has been challenging for many. So let's actually use that to trying to scan some of these questions. Okay, well, I'm going to leave Gretchen and Monica. Please feel free to scan these comments. I'll come back to them, but if there's a pressing question, feel free to jump in with that. I love seeing all the chat in there. So how did organizations react? I saw someone saying absolutely, a lot switched to virtual, which is nothing new, but a lot of organizations finally were willing to welcome that. What were some of the other strategies we saw as common themes? again, 5 of them that I see as a common theme across many of the essays and stories we collected were, in fact, this idea of relationships, redefining relationships and the definitions of community, innovations, including new ways of engaging volunteers, and like virtual engagement, adopting previous practices, existing practices that were previously met with resistance. There's leadership development, including new ways to look for leadership and recognizing it. Investment, how is our relationship with funders affected by all of this? And what does it take? How can we make the case, or how did some organizations make the case for investing? And finally, continuing that theme of shifting from transactional to transformational. So let me unpack some of these, and I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of these examples, give you kind of a smattering of ideas and then and practices that we saw, and then leave some good hearty time for Q&A and kind of virtual discussion here. So community and relationships. We saw a lot of innovations and transformations in thinking about relationships as it relates to volunteer engagement. And I did see someone weighed in saying, yeah, that newbie versus veteran challenge was something that they had experienced as well. And I really saw a divergence between organizations that were thinking very strategically around how do we create a sense of community, not just between veteran volunteers and newbies, but those who are on hiatus versus those who are actively practicing and engaging and serving. How do we create relationships and nurture community in a hybrid workforce, some remote, some on site, especially now that staff were also largely, for certain organizations, remote. And what I found were some organizations that really excelled in this, like a Cornerstone VNA, a hospice in New Hampshire, were ones that had already been thinking about this prior to the pandemic. Many organizations think about community, but had relied on, in-person potlucks and recognition events and lunch and learns to do that. But organizations like Cornerstone had already been very intentionally thinking about community and how to nurture a sense of community across the ether, because so much of hospice volunteering is a solo endeavor. You don't show up at the home of a dying individual with a team of 5 volunteers. You show up as an individual volunteer providing respite care, providing vigil volunteer services, and even another hospice we had worked with in New Hampshire prior to the pandemic had also said, even just having technology where volunteers could see the signups and scheduling and recognize how, and I mean, this is a quote from a volunteer who'd been a longtime vigil volunteer. She said, once we got our shared scheduling up and I could see how many other volunteers were gathering and pooling forces to surround these families in need, I realized I needed to up my game. And this is a volunteer whose role is inherently a solo role. And so like that, Cornerstone VNA was really looking at how to build community. They empowered volunteers to take the rituals that had been a part of their work at the facility and how to turn them into virtual or outdoor events. They really thought about how to gather virtually. They thought about what are the symbols of being a Cornerstone volunteer that they could translate over into this virtual world or this different world post or since the pandemic. Other organizations like National MS, again, going back to the story I started with, their CEO from the highest level stated a real shift in their philosophy. She stated that their priority, and this is coming from the leader of an organization whose one of the primary roles for volunteers is to support events, and all the events had just been canceled. She said, our goal is to stay connected until we can be together again. And how did that play out? It wasn't just a mantra or some quote that was at the start of every PowerPoint, staff members were truly supported with time and resources in taking time to reach out to other volunteers, to help shift event volunteers to other roles, and to really look differently at the nature of their work. We also saw, as I mentioned, an increased focus on equity and inclusion. And MAVA, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, had a dramatic increase in requests for trainings and convened national summits that they're still hosting on the topic. And here's another example. As I've mentioned, I'm working with a lot of museums, and a number of these museums right now, some predating the pandemic, some since then, have been really rethinking very deeply the role and expectations around some traditional volunteer positions like docents that required long training and wait lists in order to get in, and sometimes even paying fees in order to restructure these whole volunteer councils and auxiliaries to create more accessible volunteer opportunities. And that means, really redefining these long-standing institutions. A lot of organizations also rethought how they connect with informal volunteers. I could talk for hours about this, but I'll move on. It is interesting to see that even though the formal volunteer rate dropped between 2017 and 2021 from 30% and change to 23% and change, but the informal volunteer rate, neighbor to neighbors, helping families, has remained consistent at 51% between those years. Other organizations, and some that I already mentioned, have really taken the opportunity to innovate. Virtual volunteerism, certainly has, again, is nothing new, but many organizations, including corporations that had previously been very resistant to it, were finally able to get over themselves and engage volunteers virtually. A lot of the resistance had been, well, how can we trust volunteers? How can we hold them accountable? Well, when most of your staff is working virtually, that becomes less of an excuse, and you have more strategies to put into play. Jerome Tennille wrote a really great piece about rethinking, we've had many a conversation, one of which is in the book, about rethinking service days. And his story is really compelling. At the time, he was a leader in corporate engagement, employee engagement for a large international hospitality firm. And he had been advocating for rethinking service days for years, saying that, having a whole group of T-shirt clad employees show up on MLK Jr. Day of Service and trying to do something meaningful. I'm sure many of you are nodding and saying, yeah, that can be a real burden for my organization. And yet it wasn't until 2021 when that organization was really ready to take his suggestions to restructure that entirely and use it as a day of learning, to broaden it to days of making a pledge to serve, especially during times of year when organizations aren't overrun by large corporate and service groups. Another area of strategy kind of rethinking is in leadership development. I already mentioned a little bit about how organizations like Alive and Volunteer Match and IAVE have really shifted their role to support leaders in expanded ways. But I also saw out in the field, and these examples aren't all featured in the book, but I think about our colleagues up in Fort Collins, just about 90 minutes north of me, who were really able successfully to position their volunteer engagement, their volunteer services manager, as a leader who had resources to deploy during the pandemic. In fact, Sue Schaefer, who is their volunteer services program manager, and I just presented at a statewide conference on emergency management, talking to a bunch of emergency managers about how volunteers can help in emergency response, whether they're wildfires or floods or a pandemic. And it was because she was already a leader of the Service Enterprise Initiative. If you don't know about Service Enterprise, Alive is now managing it. Check it out. It's a really robust and wonderful program. And it was because of her work in leadership that she was able to say to city leadership, I know we might have to be cutting back, but here is the resource that I source and tap for our city. Hundreds, in fact, thousands of volunteers. And we're already working with emergency management to figure out how to leverage this workforce to address needs that have completely shifted in the last week. And so she took on that mantle of leadership and was able to use data and resources to position herself as a leader. And then again, this informal leadership piece. And I think a great example is the Develop for Good students, founders. There were 2 students who, like so many college students, in this case, they were at Stanford, spring of 2020, found out very quickly that their summer internships were discontinued, that they were canceled, really not just discontinued. The summer internships that they had been expecting and planning on to launch their career during the summer between, in one case at least, between their junior and senior year, and another I think it's between sophomore and junior year, and they realized they weren't alone. That thousands, likely tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of college students whose professions were expected to really be launched through summer internships were now canceled. And yet they also recognized that they had skills, in their case, technology skills, that really could help organizations, nonprofits, who were facing a whole new world of technology-assisted services, virtual visits, virtual training, virtual workforces, and they founded an organization called Develop for Good. These were students who hadn't had experience doing this before, but really put their minds to it and create what is now a freestanding nonprofit that taps hundreds of college students to provide digital support, coding support, technology design support to nonprofits and other organizations. And they were able to do that because even these nonprofits were willing to look at leadership from new sources, from college students who were saying, we can be a solution for you. Then we get to this piece about funding. And one of the gaps that we saw during this time was that, and many of you, even on this call, looking at some of the names, were part of some of these conversations, that funders were saying, we won't fund volunteer engagement, we'll fund COVID relief. Well, volunteers were core to COVID relief. And so how do we continue? How did some people change that narrative? Well, first of all, there were some funders that were really vital in doing that, like UJ Federation of New York, who said very early on, gosh, we're already working with a few food pantries in terms of volunteer engagement. Let's shift this focus to help them recruit volunteers to serve this dramatic increase in demand for services. By summer 2020, they talked to their grantees, heard what some of the challenging, the new emerging challenges were, and employment services was the first ripple effect. And they said, great, let's invest in some consulting and coaching to help these organizations with engaging volunteers for employment services. And they've had multiple ripple effects since then. The problem is they still remain the exception rather than the rule. Along with the research from the Do-Good Institute, we have research by our colleague, Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, a qualitative research on investing in strategic volunteer engagement. And what she found through interviews with funders, and this research is also available for download, what she found through research with funders is that, and I'll just kind of summarize it with my own spin, is that funders are a little more open to it than I think that we thought, but of course there's a lot on our shoulders to help make the case. And a big piece of that is, how do we share compelling evidence that engaging volunteers can really move the needle for an organization? And yes, while funders first said the evidence that they want to read is about numbers of volunteers and volunteer hours and the financial value of volunteer time. But many funders followed up those figures with a question about, are those really the most important values to consider? They want to know what those statistics represent. Raw numbers alone don't relay the benefits and ripple effects of having volunteers, nor did bigger numbers necessarily equate to better outcomes. One funder actually said, you know, one of our grantees got up to 400 volunteers in total, but actually we're performing better with 200. So how do we, as Dr. Sue mentions, how do we focus on the multiple impacts of engaging volunteers? How do we communicate the worth of volunteers, and align the data with purpose, not just talking about volunteer value? And as Chris Jarvis and Angela Parker talk about, how can we also structure volunteer experiences that aren't just about numbers, but are about empathy? How can we, in my words, take a page out of the service learning world to provide opportunities for volunteers to be changed, to connect with other people in the community, to be able to empathize with those who are receiving services and to reflect on their service in order to learn. So those are some of the pieces that we also uncovered as great strategies along these lines. And what I'd like to do now is pause, because I've been doing a lot of talking for most of the hour here. And I'd really love to not only open up the questions to you all through the chat, but even pose some questions that perhaps you can add your answers to. Have any of the trends from the early part of our discussion surprised you? Does it resonate for your organization? Are you experiencing these? And are there any lessons from these strategies of rethinking and redefining community, thinking more broadly about how we communicate impact, nurturing new partnerships, creating some innovations? Which ones apply to you in your experience? So I've just tossed out a lot of questions. We have about 7 minutes left. So I'd love to just pause for a moment, see if there are any questions while others might be typing new questions or some responses in. Monica or Gretchen, any questions that popped up that I missed?
Yes, hi Beth. No questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
No questions in the chat that haven't been answered yet.
Okay.
But let's see. Yes, we have somebody sharing a challenge.
Oh, okay. And I'm reading some of the others as well. I'm reading Jason's as well, or Charles, around volunteer closure, continuing to collect interest from potential volunteers and being careful not to open the floodgates too quickly. I think that's really important. And here's the challenge. Tara, our challenge, oh, I thought it was like a challenge, like they were putting a challenge out to the group, but now I get it, that volunteers are demanding more flexibility to be hybrid, but the position does not support that. It's a relationship. So that's a great question, Tara, and I certainly open it up for others to share your experiences. I think that would be really helpful. I would say that I will pose a challenge back to you to ask, are there ways you can restructure the position to be a little more flexible? I don't know exactly the nuance of it, but I think we really do need to look at, first and foremost, is the way we've structured volunteer positions over the last however many years the only way to get that work done? Or can there be more flexibility through a group owning a role together, or providing more virtual opportunities? And if not, and that's okay, then it's about recruiting and being really explicit with expectations. Megan says the tension between newbie and volunteers versus pre-pandemic volunteers is a thing now, different microcultures. And I don't know that microcultures is such a bad thing, but it is also nice to have as long as it's not cliques, Microculture is one thing, clicks is another, and how inclusive can we be? And to restructure portions of the work to be more flexible. I love that suggestion as well. Jeannie says self-directed volunteer groups are a great way to give flexibility and empowerment within the parameters that you set. Great example. And something just crossed my mind, but it flitted right out. Oh, I know of one organization in the spirit. I was thinking of this when we got to my point about microcultures, which I love that phrase, versus the overall culture. You know, I know of one institution, one museum that for generations, I will even say, has been a leader in peer leadership among volunteers, team leads, shift leads, really building the capacity of the volunteer department beyond what staff alone could achieve by having volunteer team leaders. And one of the findings from their research and really looking at their exit surveys from those who didn't stick around that they learned is that it was in part this tiered structure of volunteers that was undermining an inclusive culture in the organization. And when it came to really embracing their role as an anti-racist organization and saying, we are going to take a stand and we are going to ensure that we put our money where our mouth is, put our hearts where our mouth is around our beliefs, we are going to invest in more staff to take on some of those day-to-day shift leadership responsibilities and have all volunteers in these galleries serve without a tiered structure. And those team leaders who were never part of the problem anyway, were happy to come back and are just peer supports and peer leaders without the title, and others who were, whether intentionally or not, really undermining the inclusive environment have chosen not to come back. And they are one of these organizations that has reduced number of volunteers, but have in fact increased impact and effectiveness. Glad that's kind of resonating for a few of you. I want to do a little bit of a time check. I guess, actually, I'm just going to go ahead looking at the time, and I'll share a couple closing notes on my part, and then I want to give Gretchen and Monica a chance to give away the books. I think the most important question is, with whom are you going to discuss these ideas and these next steps? We never created this book to be the be all and end all. I always see it as my dream dinner party. Who could I invite to a table of, say, 20 people and have a conversation, so that then we can go out and continue these conversations. So please use the handout that's been posted to help drive conversations in your own community. And our lasting lessons among them are to focus on relationship with mission, with each other, with community, to welcome innovation from all different areas and share those results to see what's sustainable, to nurture leadership from a broad arena, to invest in volunteer engagement and continue that hard work of making the case, and to seek transformation, not just transaction. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for being part of this continued conversation and being part of my world. And I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen or Monica to bring us home. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Beth. Wow. That was amazing. I'm going to share my slides here to kind of wrap us up. I took so many notes, and I cannot wait for the book club, for sure. It's nice to kind of, from my perspective, here kind of reflecting on the past couple years and feeling like that I wasn't the only one experiencing those trends. So thank you so much for that. All right. So we went over questions. If y'all have any more questions, please feel free and put them in the chat. We also have documents that were recently shared for your reference. It was, we want to make a couple of announcements. First, next month, our March Academy Alive will be Finding Your Spotlight, presented by Ms. Karina Sadler, CBA. We also are preparing for the February newsletter to go out today. Please make sure to check your spam and your junk folders if you don't see it by the end of today. Check out our calendar. Of course, we have lots of great events, trainings, sessions lined up. So look to the calendar. Book giveaway. All right, everybody ready for the book giveaway? Very exciting. So I will put the names here in the chat. We have 2 book winners winning Miss Beth Steinhorn's book that she was just mentioning, along with others. The winners are Sean Reed and Haley Matherly. So congratulations. Very nice, very nice. Also, speaking of the book, there are a few book clubs that you will see being discussed out there. So look for those. I know I have already tried to reserve my spot on one. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you all. A couple of other things to go over. This is information on how to become a live member if you are not one already. You're welcome. Please join us. There's a lot to learn, a lot of community in this network. So here's some information and fees on how to join Alive. And as always, here's our information to stay connected with us. So our website, email from Ms. Gretchen. Also for our book winners, Sean and Haley, congrats again. Please make sure you email manager@volunteeralive.org with your mailing address so you can get that book. So thank you all so much. Fabulous, amazing. It was nice being together with everybody. And Ms. Beth, thank you again. I may be reaching out to you separately if it's a questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Until next time.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month. Thank you to Beth and to Monica for hosting.